We just opened with a prayer to the Holy Spirit, and today is April 7, 2013. We just concluded the Easter vacation, and we're back for classes. This class is on Saint Augustine of Hippo. I approach this class with a lot of trepidation because it's impossible to do justice to Saint Augustine in a single class, and indeed we could spend an entire year and not do justice to Saint Augustine. He is such an important personage in the history of the church and the history of the intellectual life of Western civilization. Many of you are fully aware of St. Augustine. Probably a good many of you may have read some of his famous works and studied him in college. Although I assume some of you are new to St. Augustine.
It's hard to read.
And don't really know a lot about him. And for that reason, I wanted to start off by showing sort of his greatness and place in the history of the church. And rather than use my own words, I passed out a handout by Father Phillip Hughes, one of the foremost historians of the Catholic Church, writing in the 1930s and 1940s. This is from handouts from volume 2 of his History of the Catholic Church. You can take it with you and read the whole thing, but I wanted to read a little bit of excerpts from it just to give a flavor for this. From the handout. To the Catholics of his own day, St. Augustine was the great champion of the church against the Manichees, the Donatists, and the Pelagians. Those are heretics. To the Catholic of a day 1,500 years later, that is today, he is still the doctor of grace, the doctor of ecclesiology, the builder who set on the stocks every single one of the later treatises of systematic theology. But to Catholics of the 1,000 years which followed his death, he was more even than all this. He was almost the whole intellectual patrimony of medieval Catholicism, a mine of thought and erudition which the earlier Middle Ages, for all its delving, never came near to exhausting. He was the bridge between two worlds, and over that bridge there came to the Catholic Middle Ages something of the educational ideals and system of Hellenism. Hellenism is the Greek civilization, in particular the literature and most importantly the philosophy of the ancient Greeks that they developed before the incarnation of our Lord. In any event, Hellenism comes. There came the invaluable cult of the ancient literature, the tradition of its philosophy, and all the riches of Christian antiquity. I'll skip down. He was baptized in St. Augustine. Were baptized on that momentous Easter day of 387. The schooling, the learning, the learned employments, and the centuries of human experience and the ways of thought which were to influence and shape all the medieval centuries. At the end of that paragraph, he says, and from his masterly understanding there comes the most masterly presentation hitherto seen, and which will endure for nearly 1,000 years without a rival, until there comes another mind as great as his own and equipped with still better instruments. And who's he talking about 1,000 years later?
Aquinas.
Yes, Thomas Aquinas. The only figure in the history of the Catholic Church that even comes close to St. Augustine is St. Thomas Aquinas, who came 1,000 years later. Father Hughes says that St. Thomas was equipped with still better instruments. Some of the things that St. Thomas had that Augustine didn't. First, he had all of St. Augustine's works, his enormous output. And if you read Thomas's Summa Theologica, he refers to St. Augustine more than anybody else in it. St. Thomas also had access to Aristotle, much more than did St. Augustine. St. Augustine was from North Africa. He was Latin. He didn't have much Greek. And he had access to Neoplatonism and some of Plato, but he had almost no access to Aristotle. And Thomas came along and had access to those things. And that's why Father Hughes says that Thomas was equipped with still better instruments.
I mean, I'm not being racist. I'm interested. It seems like a whole lot of our church were from Africa. And
well, this is true, and it's an interesting point. The Latin church in particular, the Latin speakers, North Africa at that time, this is the area of Tunisia and Algeria today, but it was the town of Carthage. If you recall, the Romans had utterly destroyed Carthage in the 3 Punic Wars before in the centuries before Christ. A new town rose up in North Africa. It was a Roman town. And the Latins in North Africa spoke Latins, the people did. They weren't Greek, like we've been studying all these fathers who were in the East, in the Greek-speaking East. Well, in North Africa, we've hit upon a few. And in many ways, North Africa was the most Catholic part of the Western world at the time. Unlike today, back then, North Africa apparently had better water. There were bigger towns and cities. In fact, there's a place called Leptis Magna that you can go visit today, although I think you need a bodyguard. It's in the desert, and there's this Colosseum. And I think it seats like something 20 or 30,000 people, just in the middle of the desert. And obviously, back in antiquity, there was arable land, and there were cities and towns, and there was a lot greater population. But North Africa produced, it produced, for one thing, it produced the earliest versions of the Latin Bible, and it produced, we talked about some Latin fathers, Tertullian, a Latin theologian father of North Africa, Saint Cyprian, another theologian, we spoke of him, and you move into the 300s, you got Hilary Poitiers from Gaul, and then he's another Latin writer. And until we get to here, we have St. Jerome, St. Ambrose, and St. Augustine. Those are the famous Latin authors, and three of them were North Africans.
What could we have sinned so terribly to lose such a stronghold?
Well, it's a part of history. First of all, we had, and I'll talk about that, we had the Vandals, the Arians conquered it, and then after the 600, the Muslims came. And apparently the climate changed because it is largely desert now, a lot of it. In any event, let me continue with Hughes on the next page. He talks about how Augustine, let me back up a moment. The four great intellects of Western culture are generally thought to be two pagans and two Christians. Plato, Augustine, Aristotle, Augustine, and Thomas Aquinas. Those people tower over everybody else in the history of Western civilization. Two were Greek philosophers that existed before Christ. And in their writings, however, they were able to come to certain truths through natural reason that later figures such as Augustine and Thomas Aquinas adopted and incorporated into the Catholic system. Augustine was heavily influenced by Plato and Neoplatonism. And it helped him convert to Christianity and leave the Manichaean heresy. And later, Thomas Aquinas, got Augustine, he got Plato, and then he brought Aristotle in. There's a saying that Augustine baptized Plato and St. Thomas Aquinas baptized Aristotle. And they incorporated them into the system of Catholic philosophy and theology into a coherent thing that is compatible with revealed religion, and it's one of the great intellectual works of the West. Father Hughes talks about it on the second page. I put it in highlight. He says, something of the Neoplatonist spirit, however, survived all this argument to provide him with problems he never lived to solve, Augustine never lived to solve, and which, unsolved, remained to confuse the philosophical Catholic until the great deliverance wrought by St. Thomas. Like his secular master Plato, and unlike Aristotle and St. Thomas Aquinas, St. Augustine has, from the very beginning, been eagerly read far beyond the limited circle of professional philosophers and theologians. He's one of the great writers of Latin antiquity, and his influence cannot be really overstated. I want to drop back a little bit and talk about his life, an outline. He lived from 354 to 430. He was baptized in 387. He became Bishop of Hippo Regius in North Africa in 395, and he served in that capacity until his death in 430. He was born in a little village about 60 miles south of Hippo Regius and about 100 miles from Carthage. Those two towns on the coast. He was born in a town out in the countryside called Thagaste, and he had a pagan father, Patricius, and a Christian mother, Monica. Those were his parents. And his father, they were pretty well to do. His father was a minor official, and they sent him to get a sound education, as sound as they could at the time, and he got schooled in the area around Thagaste, and then when he was 17 years old, he went to Carthage to study rhetoric. Rhetoric was what the ancients call the advocacy, what we call today. And basically, rhetoricians were the lawyers. So he was studying to become a lawyer so he could argue in the law courts. And people who did that ultimately usually got into the imperial service, and it was a great career path in those days. Much better than it is now, by the way. He came there, but he fell into Carthage was a booming town at the time. It had all kinds of spectacles and theaters and gladiatorial shows and all, and it was a life of lasciviousness, and he fell into it and was enjoying the pagan morality to the utmost, and he writes about this later. But, he writes about it in his book, The Confessions, and I'll talk about that in a moment. And while he was in Carthage, he lost his faith. His mother had talked about the church, but he came not to believe. He got where he didn't believe in the Christian church. Several problems troubled him. Number one, he heard about the Old Testament, and he got the notion that Christians believed that God was an old man with a beard and a body. And he thought that was absurd. Even worse, he encountered the problems of evil. And that is, why is there all this evil in the world if the Christian God is supposed to be all-powerful and good? The Manichees had an answer to that, a philosophical answer to that. And we studied the Manichees last fall because it's a heresy that's been around a long time. It's basically a dualist heresy, and that is, it talks about there's an evil God and there's a good God. And the evil comes from the evil God. The spirit is good, the body is evil. Matter is evil, and that explains where evil comes from. And it's a very appealing answer to the problem of evil because it solves the problem, and it also is very appealing if you want to live a life of basically unchecked immorality. Debauchery, yeah, that's the right word. Because the evil that you do and is coming is not coming from you. It's coming from either the evil God or the evil matter or the evil body. And therefore it's not something that you can be blamed for. Well, he was in this situation, and while he was in it, he got sent, he applied for and got a professorship of rhetoric. He became a law professor, basically. First in Rome and then ultimately in Milan, which at the time was the imperial capital of the Western world. And there was a bishop there named Ambrose. We've already talked about Ambrose of Milan. And Augustine had this great intellect, and he was inquiring and trying to figure out what to believe and how to believe rightly. And he came to understand through his contact with Ambrose and with some philosophically minded people, Neoplatonism, he read some Platonic philosophy. He came to understand a couple of things. One, he understood that his conception of what Christians taught was flawed. That is, God is not an old man with a beard. God is a spirit, and he came to understand that. And perhaps even more importantly, he came to understand that evil is not a separate thing. It does not have independent being. That evil is a privation of the good. A privatio boni is how he wrote about it. And that is that all of creation is created by God, and everything God creates is good and is intended to be good. And the reason evil comes in is the things that are created are defective in some way. They fall short of what they were intended to. And in particular, moral evil comes because of a misuse of the will by humans who God has given the gift of free will. And therefore, evil exists, and God permits it to exist, but it is not a separate thing like the Manichees assert. There is no evil God. Matter is good. Matter is not evil. Body is good. Body is not intrinsically evil. It can be, to be sure, be turned to evil uses, but that's not coming from God. He understood this great philosophical thing. He came to it and wrote many books about that. And it's a fundamental philosophical principle of our faith that evil is not a separate being. It underpins much of Catholic philosophy and Catholic theology. any event, he was there, and he thought, he kept arguing with himself. He wanted to be moral, but he continued to live kind of a life with a bit of debauchery. He had a liaison with a woman with whom he had an illegitimate son, who he loved, a son named Deodatus. His mother followed him to Milan. His mother was praying for him constantly. She remained a Catholic and was hoping her son would convert. And ultimately, through the influence of the prayers of Monica, the influence of Ambrose, and his own investigations into the faith, he decided to convert. And he had a conversion experience, and he talks about it in his famous book, The Confessions. I'll read just a little piece of that. This is Augustine's Confessions. It starts off, one of the most famous statements in it. It's his autobiography. He's talking about how he came to be who he is. And he writes as though it's a dialogue with God. And it is a dialogue with God. And it's one of the first almost modern books. There's nothing like it in antiquity. He bears his inner thinkings, his inner psychology. And it was a revolutionary new thing, this book. And in many ways, it still is a revolutionary thing. He starts off at the front. He says, he's talking to God. For thou hast made us for thyself, and our hearts are restless till they rest in thee. It's one of his many famous statements from this Confessions. But his conversion experience, he's in Milan, and he's in a house out in the countryside. He has a garden. He's with his friends who are also talking about religion. And he's lamenting, and he's out in the garden weeping and lamenting the fact that he doesn't have he can't leave his old life and really commit to being a Christian. And he says, and I continued my miserable complaining. How long shall I go on saying tomorrow and again tomorrow? Why not now? Why not have an end to my uncleanness this very hour? Such things I said, weeping in the most bitter sorrow of my heart. And suddenly I heard a voice from some nearby house, a boy's voice or a girl's voice, I do not know. But it was a sort of sing-song repeated again and again. Take and read, in Latin, tolle lege, tolle lege. I ceased weeping and immediately began to search my mind most carefully as to whether children were accustomed to chant these words in any kind of game. Take and read, take and read. And I could not remember that I had ever heard any such thing. Damming back the flood of my tears, I arose, interpreting the incident as quite certainly a divine command to open my book of Scripture and read the passage at which I should open. For it was part of what I had been told about St. Anthony, that from the gospel which he happened to be reading, he had felt he was being admonished as though what he read was spoken directly to himself. Quote, go sell what thou hast and give to the poor, and thou shalt have treasure in heaven, and come follow me. That's from Athanasius' Life of Anthony, which they were reading in Augustine's house at the time. One of the starters of the Desert Fathers. By this experience, he had been in that instant converted to you, Anthony had. So I was moved to return to the place where my friend Alypius was sitting, for I had put down the Apostles' book, the Apostle Paul's book, there when I arose. I snatched it up, opened it, and in silence read the passage upon which my eyes first fell. Not in rioting and drunkenness, not in chambering and impurities, not in contention and envy, but put ye on the Lord Jesus Christ, and make not provision for the flesh in its concupiscences. I had no wish to read further and no need, for in that instance, with the very ending of the sentence, it was as though a light of utter confidence shone in all my heart, and all the darkness of uncertainty washed away. That's his famous conversion experience. He then went and got baptized by St. Ambrose. This occurred in 387, and he became a Christian. And about that time, he decided to return to North Africa. He traveled back down to Rome and its seaport, a town called Ostia. His mother was with him. She fell ill and died. And he describes the death of Monica in Confessions in a very famous passage as well. She lived to see her prayers fulfilled.
20 years she prayed for him, right?
He prayed constantly for him. And she died in Ostia, and she was buried there. And Augustine went back to North Africa and founded basically a little monastic community. He was baptized. He didn't want to become a cleric. He didn't want to get the clergy. But he was so well known because he started arguing against some of the heretics there. The Manichees he'd been arguing against, the Donatists also. I'll talk about that in a minute. And he got a reputation. He's a pretty well-known person. And he was praying in church one day in Hippo Regius, and a crowd of people came around and said, make him priest, chanting to the bishop. And they basically, against his will, made him a priest. That occurred in 391. He was very careful as he traveled about after that, because he didn't want to get dragooned into any more clerical offices. And in those days, each town had one bishop, and there was no such thing as having more than one bishop. And what he would do was avoid any town where the bishop had died. Because if the bishop had died, they would reach out and grab you and say, you're going to be bishop. That happened to Ambrose, as we talked about, in the riot in the Cathedral of Milan. The people shouted, and suddenly Ambrose, who hadn't even been baptized, was elected bishop. Well, Augustine was very careful, and he was visiting the Bishop of Hippo Regius on the seacoast, a man named Valerius. And Valerius went to the prefect, the governor, the Roman governor, and said, you know something? We need to have a coadjutor bishop. And the governor said, what's a coadjutor bishop? And Valerius, I'm making this up, but Valerius basically said, well, something I just invented. I think Augustine ought to be bishop, even though I'm bishop. And he got to be coadjutor bishop, and he was forced to accept that against his will, because it drew him out of his monastic community. He wanted to live the life of the mind in prayer, and instead he became bishop. And as we'll see, that's a very dangerous thing to be in North Africa in these days. And among other things, he had to deal with a whole bunch of parishioners and people who had complaints, great and small, and they would all come to the bishop, and it really interfered with his ability to read and think and do what he wanted to do. But nonetheless, he became bishop of Hippo Regius, and Valerius was an old man, he died, and so Augustine became the sole bishop of Hippo Regius. He set up in his cathedral, he set up basically a monastic community anyway. He had his followers, and they, one of the early, he didn't actually draw up a monastic rule, but to this very day, there are Augustinian canons who follow basically the practices of Saint Augustine, who set up this monastic community. In any event, let me talk about things he did. He spoke and wrote very eloquently against the various major heresies. I've talked about the Manichees. He wrote a lot of works, treatises, letters, and he gave a lot of homilies talking about how the Manichees were in error and the heresy was not proper, and he refuted the Manichean heresy in a lot of his works. The Donatist heresy, though, took up most of his time. It's now time to talk about Donatism. Donatism was a heresy in North Africa. It didn't involve the East at all, and we've been talking about the controversies in the East and the Greek-speaking world. This was a problem in North Africa, and what happened is, you have to go back 100 years. There had been, actually let's go back 150 years. When St. Cyprian was in Carthage, Bishop of Carthage, around 250, there had been, and we talked about this back in the fall, there had been a persecution among the Emperor Decius, and Christians were threatened with torture and death and all kinds of bad things, and some of them lapsed. And some of them, threw incense to the emperor to avoid the torture and death. And once the persecution abated, those people wanted to get back in the church. And St. Cyprian and the rigorists said, no, you can't let them back in the church, they're lapsed. They're obviously not really fit to be in the church. And the bishops of Rome took a more merciful view and said, if they do appropriate penance, we're going to let these people back. Because after all, Christ gave to Peter the keys of heaven, on earth and in heaven, and we can loose and bind sins, and we're going to use that as an act of mercy and let these people back. And St. Cyprian was really unhappy with this, but ultimately the controversy passed away. Well, fast forward 50 more years, 305, there's Diocletian's persecutions, Maximian's persecutions, and again in North Africa, a lot of people, as part of it, to avoid torture and death, they would give over the sacred books or the sacred chalices and things to be destroyed by the persecutors. And when the persecution ended, those people wanted to get back in the church. Well, the rigorous party in North Africa said, no, you can't do that. And moreover, they said that a man named Cecilian was elected Bishop of Carthage in 311. And the rigorous said, now wait a minute, Cecilian was a consecrated bishop by a man named Felix, and Felix was a traditore. He had given up the sacred books under threat of persecution, and therefore he dishonored his status as bishop, and therefore his consecration is invalid. And the sacraments that he gives are totally invalid. The Eucharist is invalid from him, and if he consecrates somebody else, that's invalid. So Cecilian is not a bishop. And they went out, these people went out and elected their own bishop, a rival bishop. This happened in 312. And a bishop from Numidia by the name of Donatus basically became the head of the rigorous party. We get the name Donatus from this man, Donatus. And he wrote and went around the countryside talking about how horrible it was that the church was allowing these bishops who really weren't bishops, and these people coming back in to have these sacraments which were invalid because they were coming from the hands of people who either had been apostates or had been consecrated by apostates. And he got a huge following, and they started fighting. It spread all over North Africa.
That sounds right, doesn't it?
Yeah, there were riots. They had rival bishops in every city.
I mean, it sounds right, though.
What?
Doesn't it sound right?
Well, it sounds very rigorous, is what it sounds. These people are lax, and we're the good folks. It is not Catholic, though. It sounds right, and it sounds right to our ears very often. And frankly, you're here in this class, which indicates you're a serious Catholic. You're here in this traditionalist parish, and it's easy for us to fall into the attitude of, well, we really got the right stuff. We know what we're doing. It's a terrible thing. It's a sin of pride, and you should be very, very careful not to think I'm better than everybody else because I do this or I don't do that, or I go to this church and I don't go to that church. The Catholic Church has always had the wheats and the tares, and God knows who those are, and we're all struggling. We're all on a journey to work out our salvation. So that's the Catholic teaching. And the reason it's Catholic teaching largely is because Augustine wrote against this and preached against it, and it became accepted and nailed down for all time. The efficacy of the sacraments does not depend upon the holiness of the priest. The priest can be a bad person, can be all kind of things, but as long as he's doing what the church intends to do and certain formalities, basic formalities have been satisfied, the sacraments are valid. The sacraments work of their own powers through the instrument of a priest, and God can use even an instrument who is flawed in many ways to do that. And thank God, because otherwise we'd be out there trying to figure out the credentials of our priests and bishops. Are they really, are they just pretending? Are they really holy? And you can see where that would lead. It's a terrible thing. In 312, though, Constantine won the Battle of the Milvian Bridge, and suddenly you've got a Christian emperor who believes that he has been chosen by God not only to lead the state, but to lead the church. And there are riots in North Africa, so you've got to do something. So he convenes a series of synods, meetings of bishops, and there's one in Rome, there's one in Arles, there's one in front of Constantine, and all of these condemn the Donatists. But the Donatists don't give up, they keep rioting. And Constantine wants to keep the peace, so in 321 he does an edict of toleration. It allows the Donatists, he's not going to persecute them. This creates an unfortunate situation because for the next 80 years, 90 years, the Donatists continue with all their churches in North Africa against the Catholics. And the Donatists are not just intellectual rigorists, they are out there trying to convert people, and they have a bunch of thugs, armed people, they're called circumcellions, who go around the countryside beating up people and destroying Catholic churches and attacking bishops, and they actually kill people. They kill clerics. And a civil war is raging in North Africa. And it's one of the reasons why Augustine didn't want to be bishop, because it's tough. And Hippo Regius, when he was bishop, the Donatist party was bigger than the Catholic party. And in every town you had these warring churches. And Augustine talks about, well, in some villages, if there's only one bakery, if it's owned by the Donatists, the Catholics don't get bread. And vice versa, if in another village. So each town is divided into two. It is a war that goes on for generations. And it is a terrible, terrible situation. But Augustine becomes bishop, he becomes priest, he starts preaching against this, he starts debating the Donatists, he writes just enormous volumes of works, treatises, letters, all kinds of things to refute this heresy. And through a series of synods, there's a synod in Carthage almost every year. There are 15 or 16 of them trying to deal with the Donatists. Father Hughes talks about this. And I won't read this, but what happens is ultimately there are two councils were held at Milevis in Carthage in about 416 or thereabouts, and they condemned the Donatists, and the acts of the decisions of those councils are submitted to the Pope, Saint Innocent I of Rome, for his approval. And he approves those decrees and says, yes, I agree, the Donatists are heretics, this is not appropriate, they should not be in the church, and they should give over their churches. This approval by Saint Innocent the Pope came to North Africa, and it occasioned one of the famous sayings of Augustine. A lot of people say that Augustine said that Rome has spoken and the case is finished. Well, he didn't speak exactly those words, but what he said was, in connection with this matter, two councils have approached the Apostolic See, the Bishop of Rome. Its reply is now to hand. The case is finished, may the error finish too. This is an example of how Augustine viewed the primacy of the papacy. Many Protestants think Augustine is a supporter of Protestantism. That's absurd. Any reading of Augustine will find all of the Catholic doctrine embedded almost in every word. The sacrifice of the Mass, relics, the Blessed Virgin Mary, and the primacy of the Pope is all there. Any of it, he may have spoken too soon because Innocent died in 417 and Pope Zosimus came. And the Donatists were very eloquent, and they came to him, and Zosimus reopened the case. But ultimately, he came around too and ratified Innocent's decision. And in 418, he outlawed the Donatists, but they didn't go away. They were still there. In fact, that year, there was a conference held in Africa to try to debate this one more time. And we have the record of the bishops who attended. There were 286 Catholic bishops and 279 Donatist bishops attended this conference. So you can see how embedded this problem was in North Africa. So despite the condemnation by the papacy, the thing didn't go away, the heresy didn't go away. And what ultimately ended it was in 429, the Vandals invaded North Africa. The Vandals were militant Arians, and they were fanatical anti-Catholics, but they didn't care about the Donatists. And they came and they swept over the country, and basically it ended Catholicism in North Africa. St. Augustine died in 430. Hippo Regius was surrounded by Vandal troops at the time, and he died, and they were able to get his body and his library out before they ultimately took the city, and they took Carthage. And that was the end of North African Catholicism, and a few centuries later, the Muslim invasion came and swept away everybody there. And that was the end of the Donatist controversy. But what we get from it is, Augustine is often called the Doctor of Grace. He's also called the Doctor of the Church and the Doctor of Ecclesiologies, because he tells about what the church is, and that it does not, the sacraments do not depend upon the state of the officiant or the priest. His other great fight was against the Pelagian heresy. Pelagius was, this happened in the 400s. Pelagius was a British monk. And in 410, he and a follower of his called Celestine came to North Africa. They were fleeing the barbarian invasions. In 410, a catastrophic thing happened. The Goths under Alaric attacked and sacked the city of Rome. Such a thing had never happened for many, many centuries, and it shocked the entire ancient world. To try to defend against this, the emperors withdrew the legions from the outposts of the empire all the way back to try to defend Italy. They withdrew the Roman legions from Britain in about 405, and the Roman legions never returned. And so Britain was on its own after this, and they were fighting barbarians, and they had no Roman military support after that, and sort of paganism reasserted itself.
Barbarians being
Picts and Scots, and it's too bad Tom isn't here, probably Irish, people like that coming over the borders, and ultimately from Germany and France.
pre-Christian.
Pagans, yes. Well, and there were Arians too. In any event, they came and what they preached, what they taught was a famous heresy that basically denies the necessity of grace. What they said,
Yeah. That would.
and what they said was that man had inherently in himself the ability to do good and to seek after God, and did not need grace from God. That man, there was no such thing as original sin, and that man had the ability to seek his own salvation, basically. According to Father Hughes, man, according to the new theory, was by his nature free to do evil or not. Whatever his activities, they were his alone, and they were the only source of what merit he possessed in the sight of God, his only title to any reward. The human will is all powerful, and there is nothing to hinder the man who so chooses from living a life of perfection. The traditional Catholic doctrine that the sin of the first man of Adam had for one of its effects the loss to all of Adam's descendants of certain of the privileges with which he was created, and for another the sowing in their souls of an inclination to sin, was rejected by the Pelagians. And basically, Adam's fall and Christ's suffering on the cross were good moral examples, but man didn't need grace from God. Man could do it on his own. Pelagius and Sosthenes taught in North Africa. Augustine immediately started writing things to refute them and preaching. And Pelagius ultimately went to the east. St. Jerome started writing against him. And a little earlier I misspoke. I talked about St. Innocent, Pope St. Innocent, and St. Zosimus with the Donatists. Actually, those popes were talking about the Pelagian heresy. That is, St. Innocent, Pope St. Innocent, condemned the Pelagian heresy after the two councils. Augustine wrote his letter saying that the Apostolic See has spoken, the case is finished. And Zosimus reopened it, but the Pelagians convinced Zosimus to reopen it, but ultimately he also condemned the Pelagian heresy. Even after that, there was a man named Julian of Eclanum and 18 bishops in Italy who were Pelagianists, and they too, despite the papal condemnation, they continued to teach the Pelagian heresy. And it took many years to ultimately wipe out that heresy. Ultimately, it disappeared. It actually lingered on in Great Britain because the Roman legions had withdrawn. The Roman Church didn't have much influence there. And they sent, the Pope ultimately sent a man named Saint Germanus of Auxerre to Britain to put down that heresy. And next week, because we're running out of time, next week I will, if time permits, I will recite to you the Pelagian drinking song by Hilaire Belloc, talking about good old Saint Germanus Auxerre and how he put down the Pelagians for that. But let me talk a little bit very briefly about the major works of Augustine that have come down to us. The Confessions we've read from. It is one of the most important books in the West. All Catholics should read that at some point in their lives. It's a wonderful thing. In Apologetics, he wrote The City of God. After Rome was sacked in 410, the pagan aristocracy said, you know, if we hadn't turned Christian, this wouldn't have happened. The pagan Rome would have avoided being sacked for many centuries, and as soon as we turn to Christian, see what happens. And Augustine spent 20 years writing The City of God to refute that assertion. And it's a wonderful, amazing work. It's one of the great works of the Christian West. He wrote many, many writings against these various heresies. In philosophy, he wrote many writings as well against the academics on free choice of the will. That book contains one of the early philosophical arguments, proofs of the existence of God. And theology, one of his great treatises on the Trinity. It's one of the most famous writings on the Trinity, and in many ways has not been surpassed in terms of explaining the mystery of the Trinity to the extent it can be explained using words. On the Trinity, and it's in the handout. On Christian Doctrine is another very famous, important book. He wrote lots of treatises and books on grace, free will, and original sin, particularly against the Pelagian heresy. He wrote an enormous amount of scriptural commentaries, tractates on the Gospel of John, as multiple volumes, and narrations on the Psalms, commentary on Genesis, and many, many, many more. If you get the library of the post-Nicene Fathers, I think it's got 18, maybe 20 volumes. Well, 8 of those volumes are St. Augustine. And that's just a small fraction of his work. He's in almost the entire
What's it called again?
Well,
The name again?
the post-Nicene Fathers. That's available on the internet. If you go to New Advent, newadvent.com or maybe .org, you'll find the Fathers of the Church, and the entire thing is for free. All of the writings of the Fathers. And you'll find many of these writings of St. Augustine online for free that you can look at. So I commend all of this to you. Like I say, there's no way we could do justice to Augustine. Yes?
It seems to me that the vast majority of the non-Catholic Christian church considers Catholic still Pelagian.
Yeah, it could be, yeah.
And I wonder how that
Well, they have arguments about free will. What happened was Augustine, one of the things that he really, in his writing, he established firmly the doctrine of predestination. Many people think predestination is something the Presbyterians and John Calvin came up with. It's not true. Predestination is a Catholic dogma. But Calvin and the Reformers took it a step further. Catholic predestination said God wills everybody to be saved. And because he's outside time, he knows everything is going to happen and everything that ever happened. So he knows how it's going to come out. And he has predestined certain people to go to heaven in his inscrutable will. He does not predestine people to damnation. People who do not, he gives grace to everybody because he wants everybody to go to hell, to heaven. And well, some days, but if people are free to reject that grace, and if they do, they're to blame themselves for going the other place. Strict Calvinism says, oh no, God predestines people to both places. So from the beginning of time, God knows and wills certain people to be damned. And it's double predestination. That part of predestination always has been rejected by Catholicism. And it's one of those mysteries. The question of the omniscience of God, he knows whatever's going to happen, and yet free will of men. Because if he knows where everybody's going, in what sense are we free? Is our will free? And that's one of these mysteries that's difficult to untangle. Augustine wrote a great many works about it. It's I can't begin to do it justice here. But it is a Catholic dogma that you have free will. It's a Catholic dogma that God predestines people to heaven.
What's the easiest way to break into reading Augustine where somebody that doesn't understand it can start to understand?
I would read the Confessions. It's almost a devotional work. He's talking to God. You may not understand every single thing in it, but he's really talking about his soul and the psychology, his inner psychology, and it's you should read that. I recommend the Frank Sheed translation. There are lots and lots of translations. Frank Sheed is a wonderful Catholic apologist from the 1920s, 1930s, actually up to the 1960s.
That's the one I have. Yeah.
Frank Sheed's there are many good ones, and if you get one that you like, by all means do it. I think Frank Sheed's one is very accessible. I would read that to get into it. A bit more laborious is The City of God. It's one of his great works. And you can read a lot about Augustine. But I would say the Confessions is where you should start. Okay, well, next week we're going to do St. John Chrysostom and move into the 400s even more fully. And we may do a little Pelagian and drinking song to start. Talking about St. John.
I gotta learn that one.
Yeah.
Do we have something to drink with?
Well, we may have to do something about it. Okay, let's close the prayer. In the name of the Father, Son, and Holy Ghost. Amen. Hail Mary, full of grace, the Lord is with thee. Blessed art thou among women, and blessed is the fruit of thy womb, Jesus.
Holy Mary, Mother of God, pray for us sinners now and at the hour of our death.